It's good music.
Can you hear me?
My mic's on, I think.
What about now? Check, check, check.
Can you hear me?
Check.
I think everyone but me. I'm gonna go grab.
Thank you.
What? There we go.
All right.
All right, we're good.
We did it.
Yeah, so we're talking about sustainable agriculture today, and I think the tagline for the event was beer, lab meat, and climate chaos, which is probably like the most. I don't know. It's like, how do I make this enticing? But I don't know if that helped. I'm not sure. The point, though, is that some of the most important aspects of life involve agriculture. Coffee, which I cannot live without. Beer, which admittedly gives me a tummy ache. But I do really, really respect beer. Just doesn't sit quite right for me. And then like food, I love Korean barbecue. That's what I wrote down on my note cards for one of the most wonderful things in life. So I'd like to start with lab meat. Obviously, we just had someone on stage talking about that and someone who didn't agree with the term, but I think it still is it's still kind of in the lab in a way. It's still under development, and so I'm gonna call it that anyways. And specifically for Matthew, just because S2G has backed 2 companies, I believe, in when it comes to cultivated meats, as well as Beyond Meat, which is the vegetarian side of the equation. Have you had lab meat, or have you had cultured meat?
Yes, I have. Yes.
What'd you think?
I thought it was remarkable in that it was produced in a lab, in a reactor, but I think this is a good thing. It's not terribly remarkable that it tastes just like meat because it's meat. And I think that's what these companies are going for, is to make a product that really meets the bar for taste, affordability, nutrition.
Sure.
And it can be a true analog without having most of the negative externalities that we associate with CAFOs and traditional animal-based meat production. So yes, I've had it. I've very much enjoyed it because I very much enjoy meat, and it is meat.
Cool. Anyone in the audience, have you had any cultured or lab meats? How would you? All right, more than I was expecting. That's cool. I haven't seen it anywhere because this year has been a year where there's been like huge moments of regulatory approval, some adventurous restaurants embracing the idea. Sure. But what do you think is the holdup in more of the audience getting there? I'm just curious what your thoughts are on, is it like is it still a regulatory issue, or is it more?
I think it's a little bit, it depends on the company, right? But it's great to see that a couple of companies have received their approvals from FDA and USDA, so they can produce and sell in the United States. Cell-based meat has been for sale in Singapore in small volumes. I mean, Sputnik is up. This is a product that people have taken to market, and I think that's great for the industry. I think for a while, there was this binary risk of, will anybody ever be able to produce this? Will they ever be able to get a regulatory approval? And the answer is yes to both of those. But I think, directly to answer your question, the challenge, I think, is scale and production capacities. And if you think about land-based or traditional animal-based meat, we have all of this ranch land. I think it's something like 70% of all arable land goes into meat production in some way, shape, or form. And those are massive national assets that we have, Brazil, other places in the world, certain places have. But if we're going to be doing lab meat, cell-based meat, whatever you want to call it, that stuff has to be produced in a facility, and those facilities are very expensive. And I think the bottleneck right now will be who can actually produce the most meat at the most affordable price with the lowest cost of capital in their facility. Obviously, it has to taste great. But I think the next wave is those companies that are able to produce the stuff at scale in an affordable manner. And it still remains to be seen who wins that game. I think there's a couple of front runners, a couple that we like in our portfolio, but it still remains to be seen.
Monica, I'm curious. I don't think you've backed any.
bucket.
How come?
So our firm spun out of Kleiner Perkins. I'm at G2 Venture Partners. We have about $1 billion in assets under management and have been investing in climate tech for over a decade. At Kleiner, we did invest in Beyond Meat, which of course is one of the pioneers of plant-based food. That has been a long journey, but it's really great to see how, at this point, 20% of US households have tried plant-based food. And so it's been really great to see that journey and that transformation. That said, even though 20% of households have purchased plant-based food, it's still sort of plateauing at about 1.5% of market share of all meat sales on a dollar basis. And it just hasn't become quite as large of a market, I think, as we were hoping to see, and also has become less differentiated over time. A lot of these companies were doing truly revolutionary things 10 years ago. Now, of course, it's a much more de-risked, not as venturable category. So that's plant-based. We've been talking about cultivated meat, which of course there is much more technical risk. It's a much harder problem to solve, much more of like a venture sort of profile. The challenge there has been cost. So to Matthew's point with scale, we haven't yet seen companies have a realistic near-term path to being within strike zone of traditional protein. And for us, the stage at which we invest is typically when companies have 5 to 10 million in revenue. They have a path to reasonable unit economics, and frankly, no one in the cultivated meat space is there yet. The areas within cultivated meat we're most excited about have been seafood. It's a slightly less challenging technical problem to solve because you don't have to try to recreate the muscle texture of a steak. And then also you're competing against an expensive product, which could be, say sushi, which is a lot easier than competing against Tyson and making cheap chicken breasts. So we are keeping an eye out on seafood and watching the cost curves there. Quite frankly, it's been a maturity thing for us. The sector just isn't at the stage where we'd want to invest.
Yeah. I just didn't expect you to say seafood as an easier option. I can see why. Is there a specific type of seafood that you're keeping an eye on?
I'd say like seafood that's sushi grade that could be sold into those channels and compete against those products.
Have you tried lab meat?
I have not personally, actually. The closest I've gotten has been Black Sheep Foods and some of the companies that are like plant-based 2.0, which are really excellent. But I haven't tried Upside or any of the emerging lab meat companies. I'm excited though.
Cool. I mean, I would, just to be clear, would happily try it. It has not been placed in front of me. Maybe I should be doing a little more effort, putting in a little more effort than to seek it out. And obviously, it's tackling some really big issues. I mean, factory farming is a huge problem. It's sort of like what we were talking about earlier on the fast fashion panel I was on. It's about, there's an education piece, there's cost piece, and it is just difficult to sum up just quite how complex it is. Charles, real quick, just give us like 20-second explanation of what you do, just so the audience has some context.
Great. Yeah, so Berkeley yeast, we make ordinary yeast extraordinary. Ordinary yeast is used in a whole range of different things. One of the ones that we focus the most on is beer brewing. And what it does is basically transforms these agricultural inputs into the thing you know and love, like beer. And what we use bioengineering to improve those processes. So the yeast is making the delicious flavors. Sometimes it's making some not so delicious flavors. So we use bioengineering to affect more of the flavors you want and less of the flavors that you don't want. And there's some interesting applications that have great sustainability implications that I'm happy to talk about.
And some of those things, I mean, just so everyone has an example, imbuing beer with a sort of hoppy taste requires growing, or at least traditionally requires growing a ton of hops, drying those hops, transporting them, big carbon footprint there. So it's a sustainability issue, and you've modified yeast to have that hoppy taste without the hops. You've also done that with sort of like tropical fruits for those who like those kind of beers. If I drank beer, that's the kind of beer I would be drinking, as you could probably tell just by looking at me. So anyways, just a self-deprecating moment. But so you're modifying yeast, and you're doing it with this sustainability focus. I'm curious, though, the people who are sustainability minded might be uncomfortable with modified foods, or there's been a lot of talk about, there's been a lot of fears around GMOs, and then also it does seem like maybe we're not quite so scared about GMOs anymore. So I'm curious, are you afraid of scaring off the very people who would probably be lining up for your yeast?
That's a great question, and it is very much a mixed bag. And what we found is that one of the key, I think one of the things that worked against GMOs in the early days was that the value that was created was for the producer, not for the consumer. What we're doing is we're using GMO, if you will, we're using bioengineering to create benefits for the users. We talked about using less hops, so it's more sustainable, so that is something for the consumer. It also is more of the flavor you like, less the ones that you don't like, so that's another value that we give. And then even beyond that, one of the applications that I'm really excited about is we can create yeast that reduces the production of ethanol, so you can actually make delicious tasting non-alcoholic beer. I mean, for those that are familiar with what the current offerings are in the grocery store, there's definitely a really significant value prop there for the customer. So I think when GMOs are really targeting benefits for the customers, they're much more likely to be accepted by the public.
Do you have a target in mind, or any thoughts on the time frame it'll take you to get like a super sustainable non-alcoholic beer onto the market?
Yeah, I think it's definitely coming in 2024.
Okay,
Yeah.
Okay. Well, speaking of timeframes, I'm curious for the VCs on the panel, are you thinking, like, how patient are you? Because I didn't think you'd say 2024. I thought I was kind of betting on like 2025, 2026 or something like that. But does it require extra patience? And for founders in this space, do they have to seek out patient VCs to get...
We are more patient than we ever thought we needed to be. This is a tough tech space. I think when you think about venture capital, if you think about the information technologies or digital technologies, the ability to rapidly iterate and relatively cheaply iterate is huge, and you don't really have that in most cases within these tough tech spaces in food and agriculture. And every time you need to make a change, there might be a new regulatory hurdle. Some of those regulatory hurdles require years of paperwork and waiting, and there's uncertainty. And if you're trying to breed a different variety or a healthier variety or a tastier variety of a tree fruit, for instance, you got to grow the tree, and that takes years. And then if there's some sort of weather event, you may have to start over. And for a lot of what is being grown in agriculture, you might get one shot a season or one shot a year. And so it takes a long time to really find product market fit and to know whether or not you have something that A, works, and B, is what the consumer or customer is looking for. And the difficulty there is, yes, it's patience. It's just uncertainty. I mean, it's more uncertainty, but I think that also impacts certainly the level of capital efficiency, but the way that you have to underwrite risk, because it's not just time, it's time with salaries, and then perhaps if you're waiting on regulatory for one product, the engineers, the R&D, the team doesn't sit there. There are other products, and maybe you get broader pipelines built, and the burn starts to increase in that way. So I think it impacts. These longer adoption cycles impact the risk profile, they impact the capital intensity of the business, and I think the way that we have to, handicap or underwrite certain risks. But there's a lot of investors in this space increasingly that really see the potential for impact stories within food and agriculture and strictly superior solutions where we can meet the consumer where they are and where they're going and drive large outcomes. And it's helpful that this is a very large market. Everybody eats several times a day. Well, most people eat several times a day. So there's an opportunity, but you guys are having to be patient with my long answer here. The short of it is, yes, we have to be very patient, and I think increasingly so every year.
Monica, you invest in agriculture with a sustainability focus. You also invest in climate tech. Mm-hmm. Climate tech is one of those areas where it takes, just a ton of time and effort in order to have a big impact, especially with certain types of climate tech. There are big investments in direct air carbon capture, sucking carbon out of the air that have yet to prove that they're really feasible. So I imagine that takes a lot of patience, but at the same time, as these things are pretty buzzy topics, do you find that you encounter investors who don't realize what they're getting into, or maybe even founders who learn over time, oh my gosh, this is going to take forever to prove? Obviously these are worthy causes, but what are your thoughts on that topic of patience?
Yeah, so we invest in climate tech in these tough tech sectors, but after companies are commercial, and so usually they have 5 to 10 million in revenue. They have shown product market fit and are scaling their product. If you look at the 0 to 1 of those companies, we'd often work with investors who might have a slightly different business model. The reason we invest at the stage we do and have the timelines we do is because we're also in a business selling a product, right? Our LPs want their money back in 10 years. And so there are other funds that have slightly different products and different business models. Breakthrough Energy Ventures, for example, has a 20-year life cycle. And so there have been situations where Breakthrough does seed, Series A company gets from 0 to 1, and then we partner with that company as they're going through the growth stage and commercialization stage and scaling. So I think there's a range of capital providers and financial products, if you think of VC out there, that are appropriate for companies at different stages. In terms of whether investors or founders are just coming into this blind, I do think that even though this is a nascent sector, we've tried it once before. I think 10 years ago when people were doing this, there was a lot more of that, a lot more software investors investing in biofuels companies and expecting the same risk return profile and being surprised. I do think it's a bit different now. You have alumni from Tesla, Enphase, Sunrun, a lot of these great vintages of the 1.0 of climate tech companies who've seen how hard it is. They have an appreciation that it isn't going to be as easy as scaling the next enterprise SaaS business, but also an appreciation for how big the prize can be and how big the outcome can be. And so to Matthew's point on risk reward, we do think about it as we need to get it really right in picking who we think the winner is, because there are potentially even more dramatic winner takes all, economies of scale dynamics in climate tech than there are in enterprise SaaS. But if you do get to the right one, it's worth it to be patient because these are massive industries and massive opportunities.
Yeah, and you're referencing Clean Tech 1.0, which, there are some successes there, but it definitely was kind of one of those rude awakenings, I think, that has informed the current era of climate tech. Charles, I'm curious, would you rather be a microbrewer's favorite tool or a Miller Lite?
Like you mean powering Miller Lite, for example? I think so I'm a technologist kind of at heart, and I think the thing that for me and the rest of my team, I think the thing that gives us the most satisfaction is making an impact at a large scale. So we want to be quality obsessed enough for the small microbrewer, but we want to build a key part of what drives us and makes us so excited to come to work every day is that scales into the majors, and that gets gets enjoyed by the whole world. That's something that is extremely exciting for us.
Are the microbrewers? I know that you my understanding is you're primarily working with these more like specialized brewers right now. Are they more eager to explore the future yeast that you've developed and are developing, or are you getting bites from the big names?
Yeah, it definitely started with the small guys. So there's 10,000 breweries in the U.S., and that's actually part of why this was such a great startup market to sell into, is because there's a lot of small breweries that are not risk averse. In fact, they're very innovative and experimental, and they pride themselves on that.
Sure.
Sometimes there's only one decision maker. You have to talk to the brewer, and if he buys, or she buys, great. Whereas these bigger players, yeah, we've made a lot of progress there too, but there's, there can be dozens of stakeholders that need to check the boxes before you sell into that. And a lot of these big guys, they'll look at innovation, they'll say, they're happy to be on the sidelines for a while until it gets proven out and all the value associated with it, and then they'll hop in. So
yeah.
It's very much been a progression for us.
Have you found like the reception has been positive among the big people, the name brands?
Yeah, absolutely. People are very excited about it. Yeah.
Yeah. Any specific people?
I can't. I can say. Not. I can't speak about the big guys.
Any names we'd know?
Yes, definitely.
Definitely. Oh my gosh. Any would start with an H? Yeah. Anyways, so I have to keep trying. I have to
love it.
An M. Anyways, we're talking about beer. We're talking about lab meat. We're talking about. I did bring up coffee earlier, and there are some interesting things happening in coffee, both with regard to, heirloom varieties or stuff that's there's one, I'm trying to think of the name, Atomo. Atomo. Right. That's an S2G.
Coffee without the bean.
Coffee, no bean. I tried it at CES. The version with oat milk in it, totally, I could have fooled me. Thought it was coffee entirely, and it's got roasted date seeds in it. Mm-hmm. They're like roasting date seeds that have been upcycled, and they're also using chicory, which is often used in like coffee alternatives. I'm like doing your job for you. I'm sorry.
Preach. Keep going. Hey.
I really liked it, but I did try the one that didn't have oat milk in it. It was just like a black coffee, and it was, it was good. It was better than some of the coffee I've had. I'm not saying where I've had bad coffee, but I had it recently.
Yeah.
So,
that was an earlier version. They, I don't know. I
didn't ask you a question even, but what's on your mind?
No, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I'm curious. We're talking about these big categories that are like obviously headline worthy because they're obsessions or they're passions, but there's so much interesting stuff happening in agriculture that is more niche, and I'm curious for the people in the audience who are operators, who are founders or aspiring founders, how do we talk about, how do you even make these important things that aren't so buzzy, sexy, or whatever they need to be, so that people are going to devote time and work on them? I know that there are plenty of people already working in these fields, but one of the things, Monica, is you've invested, I think, in fertilizers. Mm-hmm. But how do you sell fertilizers when we're next to beer and coffee? It's got to be hard.
Well, I think people are motivated by the impact at the end of the day. The synthetic fertilizer market is $180 billion a year. There's a big prize to be had. Actually, the company we're invested in is in Berkeley. It's called Pivot Bio. They did a big press release a week or two ago where they talked about how they're at over 100 million in revenue, growing 60% year over year. In a strange way, the Russia-Ukraine war was a bit of a tailwind for them because it drove up the price of traditional energy, which is what is used to make synthetic fertilizer. And synthetic fertilizer is terrible for the planet. You basically use methane to create the fertilizer in the first place, which is anywhere from 1% to 3% of global emissions, depending on the estimate. And then farmers end up over applying it on the field because a lot of it gets washed off during rains. And so it goes into our water systems, creates havoc in our ecological systems.
Sorry to interrupt, but the seaweed blob, have you heard about the seaweed blob that was headed towards Florida? I spent a bunch of time writing about it and enjoyed that.
Exactly.
But enjoyed the topic, not the reality, which is just tons of excess seaweed entering entering Florida, wreaking havoc on, basically all of the coastal areas over there. So sorry to interrupt there, but I'm just curious. But so there's money. It's
Yes.
sort of that was your first answer. Is it?
There's money and there's impact. There's many
Sure.
percentage points of global greenhouse gas emissions at stake if you can solve this problem.
Yeah. Matthew, I'm curious, or Matt, I forgot.
Either way.
Either way. Do you come across any of these areas that are
Absolutely.
You're not getting the headline?
Yeah, I mean, I
maybe
think there's
they
certainly a
deserve.
couple of, if you talk about lab meat and coffee and the like, I think, they certainly get a lot of the media coverage, but I think most of our portfolio is in the in-between spaces across the supply chain, where people may not see the stories as sexy, and there may not be a direct consumer story. And I think that's part of it. A lot of what we invest in is B2B. And so you don't really hear about what's happening upstream, but the potential for impact is massive. I think, soil amendments, things that are more gentle on the environment. There's a new paradigm coming in pest controls. And all of this stuff goes into the food that we eat. We just don't think about it because it's not necessarily direct. But I think there are a host of solutions that are coming to market in massive market. These are $10-100 billion global market opportunities. And yeah, they don't necessarily grab some of those consumer-facing headlines. But I think for the investor in the space, they're very much top of mind because of the potential for impact.
Sure.
And that's most of our portfolio. The other thing we look at is second-order impacts. And so if we're trying to, things like financial services, for instance, we're in insurance, we're in data and trading. You don't think about that as food or ag tech, but certain things that can democratize or grease the wheels or make it easier for people to adopt better farming practices or participate in things that might be more expensive today or where they need capital today. Those aren't necessarily sexy stories, but those things can scale and can really drive impact at scale and volume. And so we're very much interested in those opportunities as well, even though there's not a direct consumer story.
Sure. You're watching agriculture closely. All of you are. I want to start with Matt on this one. Is there anything specific that you see and you're like, why isn't anyone working on this?
Oh. Not off the top of my head. I have to say, I'm actually very, there are some incredibly smart people working on some very large problems, and we are very impressed with what we see on a consistent basis. I think people are working on, across the board in the supply chain. I'm sure there's something, maybe I'll think of something in a moment, but nothing comes to mind that I say, I wish somebody would invent this thing, because I think people are working on a lot of this stuff right now.
Monica, you've had the benefit of at least 20 seconds.
To think about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So as Matthew said, people are incredibly innovative across the supply chain. I think one unlock that I've only just started to see people starting to build is helping to get transparency end-to-end across the supply chain. It's hard to incentivize or expect a farmer to adopt climate-friendly practices when they will get paid no more to do that. There's only so much risk they can take when they can grow crops only once or twice a year. And then why would they change their practice if at the end of the day you have to sell a commodity product into a commodity market? And so Indigo Ag sort of tried this V1, it's still pretty small, and we're starting to see some SaaS-based transparency platforms like Regrow, but it is in very early stages, and I think is a critical enabler for all of the interesting innovations across the supply chain, because that's the only way we can actually decommoditize our food and reward people for growing truly sustainable, climate-friendly products.
So you're saying you're saying like something
Visibility,
that creates
transparency, yeah, exactly.
as through the supply chain, basically.
Yeah.
And anything come to mind for you? Obviously, you're an operator, your head's down, but I'm just curious.
Well, yeah, like I'm very focused on sort of fermented beverages and whatnot, but I think the thing that keeps striking me is probiotics and the opportunity to use the same sort of bioengineering principles that we're using to affect flavor and quality in beverages. But imagine that you could engineer the probiotics that are in your gut, or we're talking ag tech, or in a cow's gut. Imagine if you can make them healthier, you can deliver medicines, you could even perhaps reduce the methane that they emit. There are lots of opportunities that you could use engineering probiotics for, and I think that there are definitely some startups that are starting to think about that. Certainly, and there's also a lot of human therapeutics-based ones that people have been talking about a lot. But on the ag tech side, I think there will be some really interesting stuff coming online.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. Well, I mean, thank you so much for taking the time talking to us about this enormously important topic. And I feel like we just scratched the surface, which is, it's all we only had 30 minutes to do it. But yeah, but thank you so much. Thank you for listening.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Appreciate it.